ladies and gentlemen, what you should be doing right now, if you haven't already started, is you should be looking at what you need to put into Notability today.
I'm trying to put it, but it's not like that.
Then think about what you can do to fix that problem. If you're listening, clap once. Okay, I'm waiting for your attention. So if you're not putting that in, and you're finished with that already, you could be writing your homework. Don't forget that you have the Membean that is due by midnight tomorrow, 11:59, and that you have your reading response number 1 due when you walk into class.
Is it the response of grade 4 this quarter?
No.
Or
Next quarter.
And the Membean?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about what we're doing today. I know most of us are finishing the download. So I'm going to wait for your attention again. So what we've been talking about is argumentation, and we're going to talk today about leading into our new unit, which is poetry. Good. So I know some of you saw the examples on the haiku. Raise your hand if you saw any of the examples on the haiku. Okay. So there are some performance poetry pieces, and we're going to be using those to do some of our activities with for poetry. And I want to talk about the one that we're going to see today and how it relates, and poetry in general, relates to argumentation. Think about when you argue something. You're trying to convince somebody of a point or a belief, right? Poetry does the same thing. It doesn't use the same techniques. It might be trying to convince you to feel a certain way or to understand a certain topic. And it might not use the topic sentence, the counter-argument, your evidence one and your analysis one, and all of those other things. But it might use certain words.
It might even make up words.
It might even make up words. It might use figurative language, and those are all things that we're going to get into as we go through this. But you're still going to have to be able to analyze or break it down and explain pieces the same way that we did argumentation. So because we've just come from that, I'm going to ask you to look at this first piece, and I'm going to ask you to talk to me about, or talk to your tables about first, what this piece is trying to argue or convince the mom of. Did you see the title of it? Did you see the title of it on today's haiku? Explaining my depression to my mother. If you haven't seen it, it's already up here. So what is this speaker or writer of this poem, and she's the same one who's performing it, what is she trying to convince her mother of besides about her depression? So I want you to be thinking what she's trying to argue or what she's trying to convince her of as we watch this. If you are absent today, it's on the haiku.
She was so nervous.
So I'm looking at some of your reactions. And what I'd like for you to do now is just what I asked you to do. Think about, based on what you saw here or what you read in the lyrics, if you follow the lyrics, the words of the poem, what is she trying to convince Mom of other than depression? So I want you to dig a little bit deeper and see if you can figure out what she's trying to convince or argue. Here. You guys have a couple minutes in your groups and I'll come around. The next piece that I want you to do is I want you to open up the document that you put into your Notability, yes. The one that looks like this, that's called Rereading and Finding Depth. Okay. So you should see a chart just like this one.
Yes.
So as we enter poetry, I'm going to ask you to look at a piece of art with me today. So this one says, understanding a piece of visual or audio art. We're going to look at some images, and you might have already seen them. This activity asks you to look at one of 3 different pictures. Now, scroll down a little bit. You can kind of see the images there. Without spending too much time, there's one of a young man, there's one of a little boy, and there's one of colorful ladies. Okay? And I don't want to get too much into them. What I'd like you to do very quickly is decide which image you want to use for this activity. I know you haven't looked at them a lot. That's the point.
As a group?
Individually.
Well, what are we going to do?
I can't tell you that yet.
Depends on the...
You're gonna look at it and analyze it. But I can't tell you more than that. So stop. Eyes on me, not on your screen. Eyes on me, not your screen. Okay. I'd like for you to raise your hand. Think about it quickly in your head, making a decision, and then we can work with this, okay? This is a practice activity, and you're going to see how we're going to use this. 1, raise your hand if you're going to use this image, the one of the young man. Hands down. 2, raise your hand if you're going to use the image of the little boy. Hands up. Hands down. Raise your hand if you're going to use the image of the colorful ladies. No one's going to be in your group. You might want to choose a different one just for today. Okay? So I'd like for you guys to pick your image. Don't look at it yet. Come back to this screen, please. Come back to this screen, please. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is view this piece of art 5 different times. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds on the clock. I'm going to have you look at it. I'm going to ask you what you're noticing, what you're wondering, and what sort of connections you're making. As you are doing this in your head, start trying to put things together, start trying to ask yourself questions, start trying to look at details and analyze the situation. After 30 seconds, I'm going to bring you back to your chart, and you are going to jot down all the things that you wondered, noticed, made connections about, thought about, details that you saw in there. Are there questions? Then we're going to repeat that process multiple times. None of this needs to be complete sentences. You don't have to start with a complete sentence. It's all about ideas, wonderings, things that you notice, details. Okay, so please scroll down to your image. I'm going to put 30 seconds on the clock right now.
Wait, we have to fill out the chart?
Not anything with the charts. Just scroll down to your image.
I'll look at it.
So look at your image. 30 seconds begins. Now, you should only be on your image. You should only be on your image looking at it. What are you noticing? What are you wondering? What details? What are you connecting?
Connecting how?
Anyway at this point. It's coming up in a little bit, you'll see. Okay, stop. I'd like you to scroll back to your chart. It is time for you to put anything that you noticed, wondered, connected, details you remember. Remember, it doesn't have to be with complete sentences.
Do we fill out everything in just one and then we'll just do it by time?
Oh, repeat the same process.
Oh, okay. Oh, it does.
Okay, guys, stop where you are. No, stop where you are. I'd like you to repeat this process. We're going to go back to your picture. I'm going to put another 30 seconds on the clock, and you're going to look at anything else that you might notice, wonder, any details that you didn't see last time or that might change your thinking from last time.
If I didn't finish writing,
You can add maybe or change it when you look. So you should all be on your picture right now, and begin. You should be looking at your picture right now. What are you noticing? What details? How can you connect them? What are you wondering? Don't be afraid to look at different parts of it closely. Maybe you actually zoom in and find parts that you didn't notice before. Look at all the pieces of it together, piece by piece, and then try to put them together. Stop. Okay, go back to your chart now. On your second viewing, you may add, continue, put anything new about what you noticed, wondered, connected, details. Remember, none of this has to be with complete sentences. None of this needs to be beautiful writing. This is getting your ideas out. look at your picture again. So, go back to your picture. I'm going to put another 30 seconds on the clock. Begin. What are you noticing? What are you wondering? What details do you see? How can you connect them? Zoom in on whatever parts you need. Look carefully and closely. Stop. Go back to your chart. Now, again, anything that you want to write that you noticed this time, that you wondered this time, or connect pieces of things that you noticed earlier, any details? All right, so here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to have you guys, since you've already finished filling out your chart, I'm going to hand you guys a copy of what's on the board. And you don't need to look at it just yet, but I'm going to ask you to look at it in a minute. I just don't want you to have to flip back and forth too much. So, I know we haven't had paper in our classes very often.
Oh,
But you can share these. Yeah, it's actual paper today. So here's what I'd like for you to do now. Raise your hand if you looked at the picture of the young man. Okay, I'm going to put you guys together in a group. Can all of the people with their hands raised please go to this table right here? Bring your iPads. The young man. The little boy. Raise your hand if you use that one. Okay. Can you meet at this table right here or divide yourselves between the two? Folks, this table is awfully big. Why don't we split into two? Why don't we do half of you here and half of you at that other one? Divide yourselves.
I'm already here, so.
Where's the little child?
Little child is here.
We're splitting up space.
Not that much.
Okay. If you're listening, clap once. If you're listening, clap twice. If you're listening, clap 3 times. Okay. So I know that you haven't seen this yet, but it's actually on your document. The reason I've given you the paper one is so you don't have to flip back and forth. Okay? And what this is a continuum of responses, or how you construct a deep response. So if you look at what we're doing today, we're talking about reading and responding with depth. So I'd like for you to write something on your desk. On your desk, you're going to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you're going to label it my responses. Get yourself a marker if you don't have one. Okay, so here's what comes next. Once you've got this written on your table, I'm going to ask you to look at your paper. Look at your paper and see, based on this continuum, how deep your responses get further and further and further, where your first response, your very first one to your picture, falls. So I want you to look at your chart on your notability and what you filled out in your first viewing. And it's okay if you're looking at it now going, oh, I don't think it was that good in the shades. And that's okay. I only want you to score yourself based on here, on these ideas, where you think your first response, your first viewing, would fall on this chart. Go ahead and write it down on your desk right now.
Can it be 0.5?
Yes, you can 0.5 if you like.
What's the maximum?
On your continuum, you have your continuum paper? Okay. So what I'd like for you to do is, now that you've got yourself scored, I would like for you to turn and partner up at your tables. And I'd like for you to tell your partner, this is what I scored myself, and here's why I think it falls in here. So maybe you gave yourself a 2, and you might say, well, I gave myself a 2 because if you look at my comment, I seem to have identified a theme, but I didn't really talk about it in a deeper way. Or maybe you say, oh, you know what, I really kind of just looked at this picture and said, oh, wow, it's really colorful. Or maybe I give myself a 1 or something. So I'd like for you to turn to your partner right now and explain why you gave yourself that. As the partner, your job will be, for the other person who's telling you, to agree or disagree and tell them why. You cannot simply say, I agree, you're right. You're going to have to say, I agree because I see this part, or I see this part, or I disagree. Okay, you have about 30 seconds to do that for each partner. Begin.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so let's start again. If you're listening to this, thank you. I'd like for you now to look at self-scoring, your number 2 and your number 3. Just the number 2 and the number 3. Self-scoring, based on the continuum, where do you see your responses for number 2 and 3 falling? And make sure that you can give proof, because you're going to have to explain it to your neighbor in just a minute. Okay, what I'd like to talk about now is we finished scoring ourselves, and I'd like for you to look at your scores. How many of you had your highest number the first time you looked at it? Nobody. How many of you guys had, looking at your numbers, your higher scores further down the list somewhere? Raise your hand if you had that. Okay, or maybe even ties. And some people, that's like the whole class. Some people even said, well, Miss, I kind of had like some low numbers here, and then maybe I had like a high number, and then I had a low, and then I had a medium. So what do you think the message is about looking at a piece of work, whether it's an art, picture, an image, it's a photograph, whether it's a piece of writing? What do you think our message is here in this lesson? Talk about that at your tables for 30 seconds, and then we'll convene again. What's the message here? Okay, folks, let's talk about this. What are some things that we discovered here? If you're listening, clap twice. If you're listening, do this. So what are some things that we discovered here? What's the lesson here? Why would we do an activity like this? What do we learn? Yeah.
How to look deeper into, like, how to find the meanings in photos.
How to look deeper. What else did we learn from this activity?
That you can't really get a good idea of a picture without actually looking for a while.
Right, you can't really get a good idea. That's why some of your numbers got bigger down here, or maybe they jumped around even, but most of us, in fact, no one in this class, had your higher response as the first one. So think about how that connects to poetry. What does that mean for poetry, Sophia?
You have to look deeper into it and look at it for a longer time to be able to understand it.
But does that mean you should stare at it for 2 hours?
No.
No, what did we do in our lesson?
We thought about it. We looked at it and thought about it.
And then what did we do? We looked at it, we thought about it, we wrote about it, then what?
We looked at it again.
We looked at it again. We have to keep coming back to it. What else?
Can I say a connection?
Yeah.
In the beginning, I thought that for the first box, I was about much more ideas.
Yeah.
I actually did visually, but further down, I put more things like what this means. And
Yeah, maybe you had some superficial things, or you had some ideas floating around your head, and some people even built on them as they went, and they kind of figured out, oh, this is what I wrote earlier. This is what it means now, right? And the idea here is that you have to look at things multiple times, whether it's a piece of art, whether it's a picture, whether it's a song, whether it's a poem or a story. And so as we do it, what happens to our construction, our ideas here, is that we start constructing deeper meanings. And I know some of us are looking at our ideas, and we're saying, I heard some people saying, I didn't get very high scores, all my numbers are the same, all my numbers are pretty low. The idea here is to show you, some of our first responses only get us part way, even if it's several times. So you kind of need something like this to look at to say, okay, how do I get to the next level? So I'd like for you right now to look at numbers 3, 4, and 5 on the continuum. And I want for you to think in your head, and then we're going to talk at our tables for a few minutes, about what you need to have the deepest, most profound responses. What kinds of things does it say on there? What kinds of things do you need to do to have the deepest responses? Think about that, and then we're going to talk about it at your tables. So now that we've talked about this at our tables, and we know, I'm going to wait for you guys again, and we know what we need to have to get deeper connections, to get deeper understanding, to talk about things in a stronger way, I'm going to ask you to go back to the poem, except we're not going to watch the video. We're going to go back to, oh, I know you're so sad about that. You're going to go back to the poem, and it's in red, in case you haven't seen it yet. Some of you used it when you were watching it. It's in red below. So this poem is the same one that you heard, some of you followed along with. And I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to look through here and start trying to make responses. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or more to look for things. And then I'm going to ask you to make some responses. And then I'm going to give you 30 seconds or more again to look again. And you're going to make a second response in different places. But this time, you know what we're looking for, right? You know what makes a stronger, deeper thing. So it doesn't mean that you can't put anything that's basic, but you know how to build better. So I'm going to ask you just to look at it first, and then I'm going to ask you when I say, okay, you may make comments, to start making comments right on there, and you'll do it maybe right next to this part. You're going to make your comment instead of in a chart. You're going to do it right on here. So let's start 30 seconds of looking first.
Can't we do it in the table?
If you'd like.
Yes.
Actually, I'm going to give you guys a little bit longer because it's going to take longer to look through. So I'm going to give you guys a minute.
Can we go writing?
Not writing yet. Viewing and thinking. Begin. Just viewing and thinking. What do you notice? What connections can you make? What details do you see?
Can we like highlight something so we don't forget?
Yeah. What patterns are you seeing emerge? What kinds of things do you remember that you should be noticing based on your continuum? So if you haven't done so, now it's time to start adding any ideas that you see. Maybe you highlighted some things, but now it's time to make the notes. So maybe you wanted to talk about this part. It meant something to you, or you noticed some details, or you thought of some connections. Maybe you started patterns. Maybe you were thinking about things that are on the continuum, about what you might want to respond. Okay, it's time to pause in your notes again. So here's what I'd like you to do. Before we go back and have another session where we're just going to look at it again and try to get another understanding of it, I'd like for you to look at the continuum. On your continuum, look at the kinds of things that you could or should be noticing that give a deeper understanding or a deeper meaning. See if you can start thinking about some of those things. Okay.
So can we erase it?
No, keep it there. So your job right now is I'm going to put another minute on the clock and we're going to do this again.
What if we don't have space though? Can we take
Move over or find more space. So we're just looking right now. You're just having another viewing. What do you notice? What are you thinking? What kind of ideas are you looking to see about putting together from last time? Okay. So now I'm going to have you guys add more. Think about how you can respond again. What are some other places that you might want to be responding? And think about your responses. Check your continuum as you respond. If you want to go back and look at the poem some more and pause during your responses, if you're building ideas, that's great. Okay, guys, we're going to run out of time here, so I'm going to pause you again. But I'd like for you to look at the continuum for your last two responses. The ones that you did on the poem. Just looking at them, how many of you guys think these are stronger and deeper because now you know what you're doing? Great. So I'd like you to give yourself a self-score. And maybe you think part of it started low, or maybe you added to it later. Give yourself a self-score on your responses using your continuum. Where do you fall? And underline parts in there or highlight parts in there that show, okay, I gave myself a 3 or a 4. Here's the part that shows that. And I'm going to come around and look.